Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this glorified hunk of scrap metal sitting right in the way of everything is a big 392 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi. Now I say big Hemi, but of course the 392 Chrysler can barely hold a candle to the 426 cubic inch second generation Hemi. That, like everything you see here, is a different story entirely. Now in previous Engine Wednesday videos, I have covered a whole bunch of first generation Hemi history. I've shown a 241 Dodge baby Hemi, a tall deck Dodge Hemi, another tall deck Dodge engine, and even a DeSoto, a 276 cubic inch short deck, which ran for like 8 seconds on video. I have some plans for that DeSoto 276, but none of them are happening anytime soon, so here it sits. Now again, I've covered a lot of this history in past videos, and so I don't really want to repeat all of that. We'll touch on a little bit of it, but primarily this video is going to be about scrutinizing the big Chrysler engine. We'll see what we can learn about the different flavors that were made and some of the parts we've got in front of us today. I'll give you the broad strokes version of the Chrysler Hemi story though. During World War II, Chrysler produced many military trucks and other things. One of those other things was an aircraft and tank engine with a hemispherical combustion chamber head. Now these were gigantic and very different from the automotive V8s that would eventually be produced, but this is where Chrysler's involvement with the Hemi design began. The original firepower Hemi V8 hit the street starting in 1951. It displaced 331 cubic inches and made 180 horsepower. Now, I've stated in the past that Chrysler was the first company to mass-produce Hemi-headed engines for automotive use, and that's true. But they were not the first company to build Hemi heads. A company called Ardun, which I've definitely mispronounced in the past, made a set of Hemi conversion heads to be used on Ford flathead engine bottom ends. That's great. But they weren't mass-produced, and they were never factory OEM equipment. That's what I'm talking about when I say the Chrysler Hemi was first. Another engine people love to bring up to tell me I'm wrong is the Ford GAA. Now this is another pretty cool piece dating back to World War II. This is a gigantic, all-aluminum, dual overhead cam, 4 opposed valve Hemi-type design. They're really neat engines. But again, they weren't mass-produced for automotive use. They don't really fit in cars, although it has been done. Again, and I seriously can't stress this enough, I'm still going to get comments about it, the Hemi design was not Chrysler's idea, but they were the first to put it to great use, and those Hemis became famous. 180 horsepower was pretty impressive for 1951. It sounds quaint by today's standards, but of course it wouldn't be long until things changed. For 1955, the 331 Hemi was a little bit different. It had a better cylinder head, a more conventional block instead of the long bell housing design used on the originals, and in high-performance models, specifically the Chrysler C300 Coupe, the engine had dual 4-barrel carbs and made 300 horsepower. Although these Hemis are famous today, and mostly for things they did outside of production vehicles, they were only used in cars from 1951 until 1958. As a matter of fact, Dodge and DeSoto stopped using Hemis after 1957. However, I do find it important to point out once again that Hemis continued to be used in heavy-duty applications until 1959. As a matter of fact, I owned, but have since sold, a 1959 cast 315 tall deck Dodge. Someone in a comment on a video where I talked about that engine said I had to be wrong and it couldn't possibly be a 1959. Brother, all you gotta do is look at the master engine number list. It's right there. Anyway, back to the Chrysler. As I've mentioned, the original displacement from 1951 through 1955 was 331 cubic inches. For 1956, the bore was enlarged to create the 354. The 354 was externally identical to a 331. The bore size was the only important change. For 1957, the deck of the block was raised, as well as the stroke, creating the 392 cubic inch engine. I, for one, find it kind of amazing that not only were there 3 different lines of first-generation Hemis, the Dodge, the DeSoto, and the big Chrysler, but all 3 had short and tall deck configurations as well. This, of course, is my short deck 276 DeSoto engine. Ultimately, the DeSoto would displace 330 cubic inches in the large tall deck size. And the Dodge, again, started out at 241, but the ultimate size was 325 cubic inches in the tall deck. Now, I say the Chrysler engine is the biggest, but what does that mean? Well, it means it's bigger in almost every dimension. The block is longer, the deck surface is longer, the bores are bigger, the deck height is taller, the overall width is wider. Now, it's said that there's no replacement for displacement. There actually is a replacement for displacement. It's boost. But if you're a believer that everything has to be humongous, The 392 is what you want if you want the ultimate in first-generation Hemi design. And that is how the 392 Hemi became a legendary performance engine, particularly in top fuel drag racing, where it was the de facto power plant for decades. As a matter of fact, you can still find these engines running on nitro in classic-style dragsters to this day. Of course, the 426 would eventually supplant the 392 as the go-to engine for insane racing pursuits like these. This one makes 7,000 horsepower. But the 392 Hemi walked so the 426 Hemi could run, and these will always be legendary in drag racing circles for that reason. So while the piece before you may well be a long-neglected, grimy, probably seized original plucked from an automobile in some unknown point of the past, it has the same awesome potential as those other engines we just saw. And that's why it continues to exist. Let's talk architecture basics. In this regard, all of these Hemis are the same. They're V8 engines, 90-degree V8 engines, with two banks of 4 cylinders opposing each other at a 90-degree angle. Pistons from each bank are arranged together in pairs on individual crank pins, and because this bank, the odd bank, is slightly further forward compared to the passenger bank, they're arranged in a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 configuration. The firing order of these engines is the same as countless other American V8s, being 1, 8, 4, 3, 6, 5, 7, 2. The 392 uses the same 4-inch bore size as a 360 LA Mopar engine and a 3.9-inch stroke. The standard 392, which is probably what we're looking at here, was rated at 325 horsepower. There was a slightly higher performance version, still having a single 4-barrel, rated at 345 horsepower. There was also a high-performance dual quad version of the 392, which made the same 375 horsepower as the later 440 HP. There was actually a very special version of the 392 available briefly in 1958 that came equipped with factory electronic fuel injection. This was a Bosch system. I believe it was called the Electrojector. It didn't work, and all of the cars equipped with that were quickly swapped over to dual 4-barrels. This engine was rated for 390 horsepower, which is just awesome. In case you're curious about that, there's actually a really good Jay Leno's Garage video about this car that goes into the Bosch Electrojector history a little bit. Eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that the intake I've got sitting on here does not quite match up properly with the cylinder heads. And there's a very good reason for that. See, when the deck was changed, the cylinder head casting was changed as well. For some reason, Chrysler didn't want to redesign the intake manifold for these engines, so they changed the entire cylinder head. They added a bit of meat onto this intake mounting surface such that it would be taller, and because this is at an angle, it would be further inward and match the dimension between the two banks of the original intake manifold fitment. So these manifolds actually interchange with the earlier short deck engines. What are you doing? I think I scared your buddy. For whatever reason, Dodge and DeSoto did not do that. The cylinder head casting remained essentially the same between short and tall deck engines for those families, although there were changes in things like valve sizes and port dimensions. For those two, the intakes came in short deck and tall deck flavors. I bought this 392 engine as a short block, so unfortunately it came without cylinder heads, rockers, push rods, intake manifold, valve covers, all kinds of special parts. These are 1951 331 heads. So that's why the intake doesn't fit. Now, this may be obvious, but you actually can still mate the two using a set of spacers. You probably wouldn't want to run these early 331 heads on the 392 engine, though. I'm pretty sure they would create various bottlenecks. As I understand, these castings are pretty different from later heads, and I'm sure the valve sizes are smaller. Now, late 331 heads are supposed to be pretty good. In fact, people prefer those in some cases for 392 builds. These are the 1955 triple nickel heads, so named because there are 3 5s in the casting number for these heads. Apparently the intake port was raised, making them much more desirable for performance use. This 4-barrel intake manifold has a casting number of 1731703. It is in fact a 392 piece. What do you guys want? Oh, snacks. Now, if you're watching this video, you pretty much have to know why these engines are referred to as Hemis, but in case you don't, it's the shape of the combustion chamber. As you can see here, it is part of a sphere. The name hemisphere implies that it's half of a sphere, and it's not quite half. It's actually a little bit smaller section than that, but still, it has this rounded shape to it, and Hemi obviously is short for hemisphere. In case you're curious, I did measure the valves in these heads. I got 1.80 for the intake and 1.48 for the exhaust. Part of what made the Hemi design so great was the ample amount of space allowed for gigantic valves. Their opposed position certainly helped as well. When I first saw this engine, it was laying on its side in a trailer, slightly open to the elements. How did I know it was a Hemi right away? Well, there were a couple clues. First, the Valley tray. They all share that design. There are certainly other engine families that do, and so just that doesn't really tell you. The torque converter attached to the back with this aluminum block spacer, that is specific to this era of Chrysler engine design, and so that was another good clue. The obvious tell would be these valve reliefs. Clearly, those are set up for a Hemi configuration. I figured out which Hemi engine I was looking at by looking at this casting number right here. Slightly buried in grime, but if I clean it up a little bit better, maybe you can read it too. It says 1673729. And quickly punching that number into Google or referring to a list of Hemi casting numbers will tell you which one that is. I expected this to be a casting date, and maybe it is in a weird format. My Dodge engines had a normal readable date in either this spot or this spot. Now, simply plugging that casting number into Google will narrow down which block you're looking at. But if you want to get more specific, there's actually an engine number right here in this area. Now, this is the same on any of these first generation engines, Dodge, DeSoto, or Chrysler. And in fact, it's also the same on the closely related Poly engines, which of course use the same blocks. Let me clean this up a little bit more and hopefully I can actually read it. Well, I'm kind of having trouble reading the entire thing. It appears to say NE5 something 1040. I can't make one of these first generation Hemi videos without mentioning hotheads at least once or twice. Their website has not been working since the last time I made a first gen Hemi video. Well, now I don't know what to think. Do they just turn this website off every time I'm working on a Hemi, or is there something wrong with my shop computer? No idea, but hothemiheads.com is certainly live today. Here's their engine number list. The hotheads list wasn't quite all-inclusive anyway. The one I've always used is on this website, Quality Engineered Components. If you do a Google search for first generation Hemi engine number list, you'll find this. After a little scraping with a razor blade and wiping with a towel, we've got this, NE571040. NE57 is apparently a 1957 392 from a Chrysler New Yorker. It is not the slightly more desirable, probably 3 NE57 Chrysler 300 engine. And that doesn't really matter for our purposes. A 392 is a 392 in all of the important ways that matter. Obviously, the top end stuff is missing, and I will tell you, I looked all over the trailer this engine was sitting in and the adjacent shop. We do have some accessories mounted on here. We've got a power steering pump. You know, in 55, Chrysler was using a power steering pump on the back of a generator mounted in this area. This has an actual standalone pump, more like a newer vehicle. Our water pump is in place. Actually spins really nice. I can't help but notice this slightly resembles the later industrial pumps used on heavy-duty engines. Here's what those look like. As you can see, although this one's not identical, it's got the same big 5-bolt pattern design. Unlike some early Hemis, this thing actually has a proper harmonic balancer, and it looks to be in pretty good shape. The drive pulley is still in place, but it's all smashed. Obviously, the Valley tray is in place. It's slightly dented. We've got a standpipe breather tube thingy here. There would have been a breather cap that sat on this. And this rear hole would have been for a downdraft tube or road draft tube. This would have been a pipe thing that would come up, go over that way, and then point down at the ground. The engine mounts for a 1957 New Yorker are still stuck on this engine. This passenger side mount actually still has the rubber isolator as well. The driver side's missing the rubber isolator. You can see here that these are mounted to ears very similar to those found on later Chrysler engines. As a matter of fact, they're not only very similar, they're damn near the same as the later A-Series Poly, and by extension, the LA family of engines. Obviously, this thing is still wearing a torque converter from the automatic transmission that would have been behind it. I believe for 57, that would be a 3-speed iron flight. It also has the aluminum block adapter in place still. If this were removed, you would see the bolt pattern on the back of this block is very, very similar as well to the later A and LA series engines. We've still got an original dual-point distributor in place. Notice this is very similar to later pieces as well, although it's not exactly the same. I mentioned in a previous video that this generation of Chrysler Hemi used Autolite distributors and generators and starters. A commenter on a video where I discussed that said, "Chrysler didn't use Autolite, that's a Ford brand." Well, yeah, that's great and all, but if you could read this tab, you would see that it says Autolite on it. Here's a slightly less destroyed ID tag. As you can see, it says Chrysler Corporation at the top and the Electric Autolite Co. Toledo on the bottom. I'm confident the history of the Electric Autolite Company could be the subject of its own YouTube video. Kind of sounds like something Brian Loans should make, if he hasn't already. There are various bits of historical Autolite footage available, though. The company was founded in 1911 and provided parts to many automotive manufacturers for decades before the trade name Autolite was acquired by Ford Motor Company in 1961. The remains of Electric Autolite merged with Mergenthaler and eventually took the name Prestolite, a trade name they had acquired from another company years earlier. If you're a Mopar nutjob, the name Prestolite might sound familiar. That would be because that company continued to provide cast iron distributors to Chrysler, which were used in high-performance applications into the early 1970s. They looked like this, very, very similar to the cast iron Autolite distributors used in the 50s. Now you know why. Take a look at this oil pan. It's a mid-sump design, leaving room for steering at the back, very similar to those used in later cars like A and B bodies. If you wanted to cram an engine like this into a car like that, well, this is the oil pan you would need. I absolutely have plans of doing just that. Not today, but someday. And not with this engine. I think this engine's going to Canada. That pretty much covers the outside stuff. So at this point, I think it's time to tear into this guy. Now there's one big, gigantic, horrible reason I have not yet done that. And it's all of this horrible muck. At some point in the past, someone was concerned with preserving this thing. On the one hand, that's cool because it tells us this was probably a good engine. Why would they have been so concerned about it rusting otherwise? It's not so cool because whatever grease they put on here has hardened to this disgusting goo. And then decades of dirt have settled into it. To get this thing apart, I'm going to have to remove all of this from the bores. And I am not looking forward to that. You know what they say though. Embrace the suck. Get it? Because this sucks. Clearly, whoever pickled this engine had never heard the expression, a little goes a long way. There's like an entire tub of grease on this thing. This block's gonna need tanked, like badly. Now I'm removing nasty old dirty grease from the bores with this plastic tool, and I'm realizing that this is exactly engine archaeology. I'm slowly and carefully removing the bits of clay and dirt to reveal the Hemi bones below. After cleaning the big chunks, I tried to clean up the remaining residue with various fluids. First, I tried gasoline. That did almost nothing. Then I tried brake clean. It did very little too, but where it was really thin, it did take it off. Good news! I'm kidding. It's not good news. Look at these rust pits. They've actually been honed. That means this was like this a long, long time ago. Like maybe it was even seized at one time and somebody tried to clean it up, and then they decided to preserve it with the greasy nastiness. But yeah, this thing needs a bore job. There appears to be a bit of rust in like every single cylinder, but number 3 here seems to be the worst. So far anyway. Working on the passenger side now. Look at number 2 here. There's horrible pitting in this piston, which you can see through the nasty griminess. And there's also obvious evidence of rust there. So now I'm thinking somebody tried to unstick this thing, was unsuccessful, and then greased it all up to keep it from getting worse. I've gotten a little more aggressive with the grease removal. Now that I know this thing is getting bored, there's really no reason to worry about like scratching stuff. So I kind of ran the razor blade down and around these bores, and it's working, kind of, in places. Now I know this is gonna come as a shock, but that engine is seized solid. So I've been alternating phases of spraying it with the magic penetrant and beating the pistons I can reach with a sledgehammer. No change yet. It's getting late, so I'm going to let this thing sit here and soak overnight. Tomorrow, we'll beat on it savagely some more. It's the next day, and our 392 continues to not rotate. So we're probably going to get nasty with it in a minute here and do things the hard way. Why do engines seize? There are all kinds of different ways this can happen. If an engine is running and suddenly ceases rotating, well, probably oil starvation and an exploded bottom end. In I'd say 90 bajillion% of cases that I see of old engines that have been sitting around for a long time and no longer want to rotate, it's rusty rings. It's always rusty rings. In classic engines from this era, the compression rings are cast iron, and the block is cast iron. And what happens as they sit for decades, like this one obviously has, is those rings rust to the cylinder walls. So obviously what we're doing here is using some penetrating oil and the repeated shocks of hammer blows to try and free those rings from those cylinder walls. They're probably seized to the piston as well. You can tell right away from the tone of the hammer blows that these pistons are not moving. It's just a solid thunk sound. It's pretty impressive actually, because they all seem to be like that. I've had commenters in the past say, I don't understand why anyone would be dumb enough to torque on the harmonic balancer bolt trying to free a stuck engine. Well, for one thing, that bolt's good for like 150 pound-feet of torque. For another, it works, it's proven to work. And for a third, I'm not reefing on it so hard to even be able to loosen that bolt or massively over-torque it in the other direction. Yes, I'm applying some force back and forth trying to get the crank wiggling, but I'm not putting my entire weight on the end of this breaker bar much. Now, if we're talking about the guys that choose to grab an 8-foot-long cheater pipe and put it over a breaker bar to try and free a stuck engine, those guys are insane. One thing I haven't tried yet is heat, so I guess we can do that. Of course, if I'd broken out the torch yesterday, then I would have learned at a more useful time that this horrible old nasty grease is loosened right up with the torch. Well, still, that's made no difference at all. It's very, very stuck. I can't detect any movement in any of these pistons. So I guess at this point, I'm going to start removing accessories. We'll get down into this thing, see what things look like, and we may well just be removing these rods and pistons one at a time and beating them off of the crank. If you watch this channel much, you know I do this kind of stuff a lot. I also get lots and lots of comments. I read most of them, and I respond to some of them. One silly comment I've gotten a couple times, Jamie, you should build a giant vat of horrible fluid to soak all of these blocks in. Where am I supposed to put that exactly? Jamie, you should get a giant inductive heater to heat these blocks. Where am I supposed to get that exactly? And where do I put it when I have it? This poor distributor's pretty haggard, but I'm gonna try not to make it worse. See, that looks exactly like a small block Chrysler. I think there's a shaft length difference though. This thing's kind of seized. We'll call that a good core. Actually found a shred of decent silver paint on this valley pan. Not all, but most early Hemis were painted silver. Well, that was easy. Yeah. These are usually full of chunks. Yeah, well, it could be worse. Here's what the valley looks like. This appears to be residue from the same nasty grease. And there might be some mouse turds in there and a little bit of other stuff, but overall, it's actually pretty clean in here. I did direct some penetrating spray in here yesterday. Doesn't seem to have helped much. I think we can get these out. Now, these are hydraulic lifters. The standard Hemis all had these. They did not have adjustable rocker arms, which is unfortunate. If you want to do go-fast stuff, those are kind of nice to have. Unlike my DeSoto engine, these are a pretty conventional lifter. Kind of tall compared to the later ones. Full of rust and horrors. You can see there the clip that retains the center piston section down there. Yeah, a little rusty. A little bit of additional spray helped. These do have these holes in the top. I'm able to grab them with a pick and start wiggling them. The penetrant kind of gets in where it needs to be, and eventually they come out. More fire. This one was real stuck, but a bit of light beating, some heat, and then several rounds of spray, I did finally get it to pop out. The problem ones are the ones that I cannot get the poker into a hole. And even like trying to go in here and find it and wiggle it back and forth, so far that is not working. Now, even when they're not rusted solid, old lifters are always hard to get out. And I broke it. I don't even know how I did that with my tiny poker tool. This thing was already moving. It makes no sense. Anyway, as I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, it's always hard to get old lifters out because of the varnish that builds up on the bottom of them below the lifter bore. You're kind of scraping that through the bore as it comes up. If you can't get them fully out, but you can get them clear of the camshaft, once the cam is removed, you can knock them down through the holes, and that's sometimes easier. Now, obviously, seized lifters are a problem. Are these totally seized lifters the reason this engine won't spin? No. Things are coming off. Power steering pump, water pump and housing, front pulley, and a bunch more grime. With the pump out of the way, I can see the timing chain. It is not seized solid. I guess that's good news. Here's an interesting factoid. Because of the cylinder head design, Hemis and poly engines share an oil return hole down into the sump. These are found in the corners at the front and the back. I've seen in the past in a 318 poly, one of these passages clogged completely solid with nasty buildup. So that's something to be mindful of if you're going to attempt a freshening of one of these engines. This one was pretty much clogged solid before I started stabbing at it. Hey, it's like an engine stand. Look at all the rust chunks that just came out of the coolant passages. Apparently somebody's had this pan off before. Either that or they just removed all but 4 of the bolts for fun. Why are we stuck? It's catching on the bolts for the guard back there on the bell housing adapter. Anyway, here's our first look in there. Oh boy! What do you think of that rust line there? Apparently this thing sat with gallons of water in it for a long time. That's pretty gross, but I'm sure it just fell on that when we rolled the engine over. That means there was probably more debris in there, and it's been dispersed in here. Couple things right away. There is some visible rusty stuff down here. There's also visible grease. So I think whoever greased the top of the engine had this pan off, and they came in and greased all of this too. We should be able to wiggle the big ends of each of these rods. They don't move. Like, not one of them moves. So, are they all rusted solid? Are they all packed full of that grease? I don't know, but I'm going to start heating and spraying and beating, and we'll see if these things want to budge. I took the liberty of pulling that guard out of the way. Now we can look at the front side of the torque converter. Now, if you know these early cars, this won't be news to you, but in case you don't, these things did not use a flex plate. Chrysler introduced the flex plate to their automatic transmission setup in 1962. Prior to that, these converters were actually secured directly to the crankshaft using 8 nuts that go onto studs stuck in the converter. Because this thing won't turn, removing that would be really, really difficult. The good news is there's this big opening here, so in the event that we can't get this thing rotating and get all those nuts off, we can loosen the rods and the caps. Obviously the balancer and timing cover need to go, and then we'll be able to remove this thing with the torque converter attached. This early style oil pickup is interesting. Notice the little tang. That is intended to bottom out on the oil pan when it's installed, creating the perfect gap for this. Here's the early Hemi oil pump. It's very similar in its configuration to the later small block pumps, but it is not exactly the same. It's also kind of stuck. There we go. That should look pretty familiar to you if you've ever built an A or LA series engine. We'll see if this works. I'm not holding my breath. Yeah, with some heat and some light tapping, I am now seeing these things move a little bit. You can see that rusty, nasty goop that's being forced out of that gap. As you may have noticed, we had 2 pistons at TDC. Number 1, which is interesting, and of course number 6, which is ganged together with number 1. Those 2 pistons move in unison. Under number 1, the cylinder wall looks beautiful. There's a little bit of residue there from water coming down and causing rust, but overall it's nice and shiny. Under number 6, it's a very different story. It's pretty much all rust right there. Usually when we're dealing with issues like this, we're focused on the rust above the pistons and getting that cleaned up. But in cases where there was a ton of moisture in the crankcase, like here, it's not at all uncommon to see this. Now there is another possible factor preventing rotation here, and that is wrist pin movement. It's not at all uncommon to see those seize up. Because these early engines use full floating pistons with bushed rods, there are more opportunities there for movement to be present, but it's still a possible issue. I've gone through and sprayed all of these pins. All right, at this point, I'm done messing around. I'm just gonna start pulling these rod caps one by one, and I'll see if I can get movement out of any of these pistons. I already know, based on the corrosion damage on a couple of them and the fact that this engine will need a bore job, that the pistons won't be saved. We're certainly gonna try not to damage the rods or anything, but I may well end up bashing the undersides of these pistons to try and get them moving. Here's our first rod cap off. I started with number 7 for some reason. Yeah, it looks kind of nasty in there, but it also looks oily. After all of these years, there's still an oil film. Here's the back side of the first rod bearing shell. I see a number, CB513M, and then it says MG12-. There's nothing here with a date or anything indicating an undersize. I managed to find that number on eBay. It is, in fact, a factory size 392 Hemi rod bearing. So that is great news. The other great news, of course, is this crank looks fantastic. At least so far. Initial attempts getting that piston to move, wholly unsuccessful. That guy's stuck. I bet all of these are going to be exactly the same. I popped the cap off its neighbor, number 8, gave it a light tap, and what do you know? A gap is opening up. This rod is moving. It's not happy about it, but it is going. Defying all possible logic, that number 8 piston just popped right out. There's our first piston. Obviously, you can see all the horrible gunk packed around those rings. The rings themselves look surprisingly decent. Some light scraping on the skirt. And there is some horrible, nasty carbon buildup around the pin there. You can see the clip in there for the floating pin. So far, the pin seems to be stuck in the piston, but that's all right. We can solve that with a hammer. I got this cleaned up a little bit, and look at this. The top ring is even moving on one side. If all of them looked like this, well, this engine would have been a candidate for a pretty easy revival. But of course, they don't. You can get a look at the domed piston here. It looks a lot like a street Hemi piston with the large flat pad on top, except it's even larger and flatter. Obviously, the compression could be raised in this design engine simply by increasing the size of that dome. Anyway, now I'm trying to get all of these piggies wiggling. I'm removing the rod caps I can get to. The good news is they are all numbered, so we'll get them back the way they belong. I'm kind of laying things out in order here as we go. Anyway, this is the cap for number 3. Look at this horrible stuff that was jammed in that oil hole. And it somehow ended up like leaking down against the bearing over the years. All right, here's a good one. This is rod cap and bearing number 4, and there's a very obvious dry patch there in the middle. That would be an area where the bearing and the crank had kind of sort of corroded together. Obviously, this is something that can happen, but it's nothing I've ever seen before. That left a pretty cool witness mark. There's some other interesting stains and shiny spots on these journals as well, but they still look and feel pretty good aside from that. Notice I am removing the rod bolts where possible as I go. This is so that if I do get to a point where the crank wants to rotate, those things will be out of the way, there will be more room to operate, and we don't risk scratching the journals with them. In all likelihood, this is probably going to get turned 1010 anyway, but we don't want to do any more harm than good. Dang it! I got number 7 moving, only the second one to do so, but at what cost? My hammer slipped off the drift I was hitting, and I dinged this journal. It's going to be fine, but it's really annoying. Let's just say things aren't going well. I'm going to get the main caps loose and see if that helps things. To do that, of course, the harmonic balancer and the timing cover need to come off. Sometime today. Thank you. Ooh, oil slinger. Well, that's interesting. There's actually a drip tab in this engine. Small block Chryslers didn't have that for a time, but then later they did. This, of course, is a standard factory single row timing chain, but look at how wide that row is. Pulling that chain now, the hardware sure looks familiar. We've got the eccentric for the mechanical fuel pump, the bolt, and the button. The cam gear put up a bit of a fight, but it is coming off. I've noticed as I'm working it back and forth, the cam itself is actually rotating, so that's good news. Strangely enough, the crank gear just kind of moved. Here's an interesting detail. The Woodruff keys for the harmonic balancer and for the crank gear are separate. They're also a different size. The harmonic balancer uses a much larger one. I'm going to have to knock that out to get this crank gear off. There's the cam retainer. Not the same as the later engine families, but very similar. Yeah, it was wiggling. It took some doing to get it to turn any more than that. But now we're here. I know for a fact I've forced at least one lifter upward as I've worked it back and forth like this. I don't know if it's going to be enough to sneak it by or not, because if there are still lifters down on the base circle, well, they're going to get in the way of the lobes as they're trying to come by. Wow, the quickest little spray of PB blaster at lifters and bearing surfaces, and now we've got this. Now I've got all the main caps off. These bearings look pretty great, although number 2 did have a little patch of that same corrosion stuff. These are fully grooved main bearings, which is really interesting. I did pop the first one out and look on the back. It's a similar number, obviously the correct number for mains, and there's still no date code, which is unfortunate. I do notice the rear main seal is offset ever so slightly. The main journals are looking pretty good. Number 2 is still sticky, but that looks nice. Number 1 looks all right. There are some little spots, but nothing major there. The fact that it now does this tells me this is probably going to start going a bit better. Now all I need to do is kind of carefully get it up out of there and scoot it over to the side so I can get the bolts off of the number 5 rod. And then this crank should come all the way out. Moving the crank like that popped the number 2 rod cap right off. I was fighting with this one. It did not want to budge. I can see why. What a horrible mess. But I got it, so this will just lift right out now.
Of course, cranks are always stupidly heavy, but this one has a torque converter attached to it. Where's Alan when you need him? Ah! Oh, yeah, buddy. Okay. This is... Stay. Sure.
Oh, what a horrible mess this has turned into. At this point, I've already dealt with all the low-hanging fruit. The rest of these pistons, I'm going to have to fight for. Take number 1. Despite being almost a TDC, you can see how terrible this thing looks. The ring grooves there are just packed full of rust and nastiness. This thing would not move outward. So I beat it savagely with a hammer inward, and then I scrubbed the wall of the cylinder a little bit, hit it with some PB Blaster, and then it basically came right out. With some swearing, and some beating, and some smashing of my pointer finger. Now, before this was off the crank, I had already gotten really nasty with it because I figured, this one's up at the top of the bore. It should come right out. Well, it didn't, and I allegedly broke the piston with my pry bar. So that's unfortunate, but again, these weren't going back in. It is never my intention to break parts that could be useful later. Obviously, I'm a Mopar hoarder, and I want to retain as much of this equipment as possible, but in the case of these pistons, I'm just done. I've smashed enough digits, I've said enough bad words. I'm going to get them out by any means necessary without ruining the rods. As I'm madly swinging a sledgehammer at a drift, trying to knock these things loose, I'm going to try and not beat the saddles with it. That's my bad again. Sometimes I find myself wondering why I ever chose this as a hobby, let alone a profession. It's greasy, it's stinky, and often it's painful. Here's piston number 2. This is one of the ones that was rusted forever and ever and ever ago. Look at this terrible pitting. Also, look at how much I deformed this piston with a hammer. This was super stubborn. Definitely a big part of our problem right here, and I kind of knew that. But honestly, the vast majority of these have been just as hard to pull as this nasty, rusty one. I've got 2 more rods and pistons to get out of this block, but while I'm thinking about it, I just want to say, if you're trying to preserve your engine, if you want to reuse these parts, if you're just trying to get your engine unseized, don't do any of this. Don't beat them savagely with a 4-pound sledgehammer. Definitely don't put a pry bar down on the backside of the pin and smack that with a sledgehammer. You will damage your pistons. This engine is going to go on to live a full, exciting life with brand new pistons and fresh bearings and a machined crank and refinished bores, obviously. So in this case, it really doesn't matter. If I had used a better penetrant, yes, I'm aware Blaster isn't the greatest stuff in the world. And if I'd let this thing soak for an extended period of time, I guarantee you this teardown would have gone better. But I didn't do that, and I only have so long to make these videos, so I kind of just need it apart. Man, this just sucked every bit of the way. But there's the last piston out, number 5. Number 5 was another one that had obvious horrible rust issues. And yeah, it sure did. Tearing down greasy old engines always makes a horrible mess. So for this one, I made a concerted effort to keep the floor clean, vacuuming countless times and wiping up little spots. As you can see, it didn't last. You know, at one point, the floor in this shop was nice and perfectly clean. And then I bought it. Pulling the block adapter off the back now, this would only be useful with the factory automatic. With pretty much any other transmission, you're either going to get a bell housing or you're going to get an adapter to adapt a later automatic. Sometime today. The adapter is sandwiched against the block using these bolts. There are 2 here that secure the plate individually from these that sandwich it in there. 1 threads into the block from this way, and 1 threads into the plate from the other way. There we go. You can see there are dowels on the block that locate that plate, and then dowels on the plate that locate the automatic transmission. I've just remembered that somewhere on this earth, I still own the block adapter plate and the torque converter from the 1955 New Yorker I got running, then had to take apart and eventually sold like a decade ago. I'm confident I'll never need either of these, and I doubt anyone else on earth will either. They're not exactly desirable pieces. Removing the torque converter now, surprisingly, this hardware actually came right apart. And here's our crankshaft liberated and slightly cleaned up. Obviously, it's going to need some more love from a machinist. In general, this is really nice. The Tall Deck 315 Dodge engines I had, both had been exploded and rebuilt multiple times. Both crankshafts I had been machined multiple times. And so to open this thing up and find this crank in original condition like this, that's pretty great. I always like to compare these first-gen Hemi parts to LA Mopar parts. Really, I'm an LA Mopar guy. I've built countless LA engines. I've got tons of them here in the shop. And obviously, I've got plenty of cranks and things laying around, so it's easy for me to just grab one and set it next to our Hemi crank. Look how similar these are. Obviously, the Hemi crank is slightly taller. The reason for that, it has the extended flange at the back for that early transmission type. In fact, it's even more tall than it appears compared to the LA crank, but this one happens to have some bolts in the back. The configuration of the counterweights, the clocking of the pins, all exactly the same. The LA engine uses a smaller rod bearing, and obviously this crank, being from a 273 or 318, has a shorter stroke, but they're still very similar. They're not quite similar enough that you can drop an LA crank in a 392 block, but it's close. Like, very close. Rotating the camshaft was the move. All of the stuck lifters are now not so stuck, and they're at least at max lift, so should be able to work them out one by one. And I broke a second one, which took like no effort. Like that 3, only this one broke on both sides. Obviously, prying stuck lifters out isn't what these holes are for. I'm not sure what these holes are for. Maybe draining excess oil out of the cups there. Anyway, I've gotten all but 2 out of the way of the camshaft coming out now. We'll see if I can't get them moved without destroying things. I did manage to extract the camshaft. This appears to be a good core for regrinding. Interesting thing here, the front cam bearing journal is very similar to a 426 Hemi. Those are grooved all the way around. This one is grooved partway around and then partway around again. And in the middle of this groove, there's a large hole drilled this way and then a small hole drilled this way. That was obviously there to lubricate the timing set. There are also small holes in the number 2 journal and in the number 4 journal, and these are there to lubricate the rocker arms. Just like later Chrysler engines, there are cast-in oil passageways going from this cam journal up through the deck, and from this cam journal up through the other deck. In case you were curious, and let's be honest, you weren't, the later LA camshaft retainer plate does not work on these engines. Now the bottom 2 bolt holes line up, and this seems to be centered right on the camshaft tunnel, but the top 2 are different. They're farther apart and farther down, and the oil galleys or galleries or the oil squirty tube holes or whatever you want to call them are at a slightly different height, so you can kind of see them below that plate. Notice, they do not have core plugs. The plate is all that capped those from the factory. Though the end is slightly different, and I'm sure the length is a bit off, the intermediate shaft is very, very similar to the small block ones. You can see it has the same basic drive end for the distributor, and it has the same issue as later engines. These things end up jammed in the little bushing they ride in due to the nasty carbon buildup stuff. Interesting note, this is actually pinned from the factory. Most LA shafts are not. I did finally manage to get all the lifters out. Only this one, which I managed to break around both holes somehow, had to be knocked into the block. I've got the main caps back on our block now, partially for safekeeping, and partially so we can admire yet again the incredible similarity between this and the LA Mopar engine family. It's kind of amazing the number of details that didn't change. Yes, the dimensions are a little different, but it's the same 2-bolt setup. The caps even look the same. Starting with the 331 in 1951 and ending with the Magnum series of engines in the early 2000s, Chrysler got over 50 years out of this same basic architecture. And that is amazing. Now for high performance use, of course, the 2-bolt main setup is a little underwhelming. It's not as underwhelming as, say, a small block Chevrolet, for example. But for extreme duty, it's a very common procedure to add 4-bolt mains to these engines. That's only going to be on the middle 3 caps. It's done with a set of aftermarket 4-bolt main caps and some drilling and tapping of the additional holes. There's plenty of meat here to accommodate that. I do notice an interesting detail here. There are windows through these main saddles in between each pair of bores. That's a good bit different than the LA block. I've discussed this many times, but today I thought I'd actually show you a small block Chrysler bell housing sitting on a first-gen Hemi block. These 5 bolt holes line up perfectly. And although I don't have it quite centered right, you can see here the crank is kind of sort of right where it would need to be with respect to this hole. Now you can't simply run a bell housing like this without some other considerations, because the 2 big bolt holes here and the dowel pins are nowhere near right. So an adapter is still necessary, not totally unlike the factory automatic transmission adapter, which will go onto these pins and give you the right ones. Also, you'll need a special flywheel to make this work. Here is that adapter kit on the Hotheads website. Note, it's not exactly cheap. You better get used to that. Whew. That was something. Fun, maybe. What did we learn? I don't know, but I have some parting thoughts. Classic Hemi engines are neat. They've always been desirable since their inception. None are more desirable than this guy. But the other ones are pretty great too. Obviously, the performance potential of the Hemi head is what makes these engines truly great. But they're also excellent hot rod engines, particularly because of their good looks. If you've got some sort of open engine compartment situation, you've deleted the sides of the hood on your 32 Ford or whatever, there's nothing better than looking in and seeing the gigantic valve covers of a Hemi. And of course, in a light little car like that, even a stock one makes enough power to have a good time. I've owned 7 of these engines. Most of them have never run. I currently own 3, and actually 2 of them run, which is a pretty good average for me. I have always been attracted to the first-gen Hemi platform, partially just for the name, Hemi, partially for the look, the pedigree, but mostly because they're a little bit more affordable than the 426 Hemi. And when I say a little bit, well, these days, it's really easy to pick up as many of these things as you want. There are a couple different factors bringing down the prices of these engines. One of those is surely the existence of the 3rd generation Hemi. Most Hemi builds today center around those. They're easy to get a hold of, and they're really easy to make big power with. I've owned 4 3rd-gen Hemis, but only 1 has ever run. I'm sure we'll talk about this thing eventually. Another factor is surely the unfortunate reality that the older people who have been collecting these things and enjoying them for decades now are unfortunately gradually leaving us. It's the same factor bringing down the cost on various collector vehicles and putting things into circulation. As a matter of fact, the garage sale I bought this specimen at was part of an estate sale. My DeSoto and the 241 cubic inch baby Hemi, which I've since sold, both came from a gentleman who bought an entire collection of engines from an estate sale. My other running Hemi is in this 1955 Imperial sedan, which is still sitting in the yard at Tom's place, by the way. That car, of course, came from, well, basically an estate sale, although technically the gentleman was still living. Anyway, my point is this. If you want to build one of these first-generation Hemis, there's probably never been a better time than now to go out and buy one. I think I've seen around 10 hordes of first-generation Hemi parts for sale on Facebook Marketplace in the last year. One guy will have a bunch of Dodge stuff. One guy will have a pile of DeSoto heads. Another guy still has 3 complete Chrysler short deck engines listed for sale. And these prices keep going down and down because there aren't very many people out there collecting them anymore. The automotive world has changed a lot in recent years. There is no doubt in my mind it's going to continue doing that. But I'm hopeful with this series of videos, I can convince at least a few of you out there that building these engines is still doable. It's still fun. And if I have anything to say about it, we'll keep these things out of the scrap pile. Oh yes, and if you own a car from this period, if you're sitting on Grandpa's 1957 New Yorker with a Hemi under the hood, leave the Hemi under the hood. Stop plucking these engines for other projects. There are plenty of them left out there to buy. This is something I keep seeing. I have friends who have done this. Why? Let's preserve these things for future generations. I mean, just look at that. That's what the car this 392 came out of would have looked like. If you ask me, it's amazing. It might be some of Virgil Exner's finest work. Okay, sure, the front end strongly resembles a Ford Fairlane. Still, though, yeah, it's almost creepy, actually. Who here remembers that I used to own a 1958 Ford Fairlane? Google remembers. I think that's about it for this one. As I've explained, I won't be building this engine, so I tucked it right back where it was, where it will sit slightly in my way until the new owner comes to pick it up. I would never claim to be a first-generation Hemi expert or anything, but I have had my hands in a bunch of these at this point, and I've done tons and tons of reading on the subject. So, if you do have any questions, you can feel free to drop them in the comments. I would be lying if I told you that I saw all of those at this point. There are just too many. But I do my best to read through them and answer things where I can. Again, if you want to see me actually build a first-generation Hemi, well, that's coming in the future. Not anytime soon, but I'm very much looking forward to it. It's gonna be silly. And if you want to see me screw together a horsepower producing machine of epic proportions, well, we're gonna do that too. So stay tuned. Of course, every Wednesday afternoon, I put out another video on a Chrysler engine, whether that's a Slant 6, a small block, a big block, or a Hemi. I've got history, I've got greasy teardowns, I've got rebuilds, I've got tips and tricks, all kinds of stuff. So I hope you'll come back and join me for the next one. Until then, as ever, thanks for watching. And remember,